September 15, 1944, 5:47 hours. The first light of dawn barely brushed the jagged peaks of Pelu Island, casting long ghostly shadows across the jagged coral cliffs of Bloody Nose Ridge. Within this natural fortress, Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto crouched silently in his reinforced bunker, the air thick with a mingled sense of sweat, gun oil, and damp stone. For 3 months, Yamamoto and his men had toiled tirelessly to transform these coral caves into a fortress worthy of the Japanese Imperial Army. Each bunker was a marvel of engineering discipline: concrete reinforced walls, overhead cover, and overlapping fields of fire designed to crush any attacking force. Every sightline had been carefully measured, stretching 800 yards across the narrow invasion beaches below, allowing his men to see the enemy long before the enemy could see them. Yamamoto ran his gloved fingers along the rough surface of the coral wall, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The ridge was not just a piece of terrain, it was a statement. A statement of defiance, of preparation, of unyielding resolve. His unit had studied every American assault in the Pacific, from Tarawa to Saipan to Guam. They had dissected battle reports, mapped troop movements, and memorized the rhythm of American firepower. Mortars, rifles, naval bombardments, nothing had been left unconsidered. Each position had been calculated with meticulous care, every angle covered, every line of approach anticipated. The Imperial Army believed that this ridge, Bloody Nose, would hold against anything the Americans could throw at it. Outside, the first birds of dawn scattered nervously in the wind, as if sensing the storm that was about to arrive. Inside the bunker, Yamamoto's men adjusted their positions, checked their rifles and ammunition, whispered last instructions, and waited. There was an almost ceremonial stillness to the scene, a calm that only those on the edge of combat could recognize. For Yamamoto, every creak of the bunker, every distant wave crashing against the reef below, was amplified in his mind. Hours of preparation, sweat, and strategy coalesced into this single silent moment. Then, at precisely 0612 hours, the stillness shattered. From an angle no one had predicted, a weapon erupted, a sound so alien, so thunderous, that it seemed to fracture the very air. Yamamoto's trained eyes scanned the horizon, but the weapon's origin defied the calculations, the doctrine, and the expectations his men had labored over for months. In less than 4 minutes, the fortress they had so painstakingly built began to unravel. The coral walls exploded into dust, concrete reinforced positions crumbled, and soldiers who had been prepared to die with honor were cut down before they could even locate the source of the fire. The weapon's roar was continuous, relentless, and utterly unlike the controlled bursts of Japanese machine guns. It was as if the air itself had become a battering ram, tearing through coral and concrete alike. The bullets did not merely suppress, they annihilated. Men screamed, ducked, and scattered in confusion as the line disintegrated, turning what was meant to be a disciplined defensive position into chaos. Yamamoto's heart pounded as he realized that everything they had planned, every calculation, every drill, every fortified position, was now being tested against a force they could not comprehend. By mid-morning, Yamamoto would retreat to the small dim interior of his command bunker and scrawl into his journal a phrase that would later echo through the annals of captured Japanese documents: Akuma no Buki, the devil's weapon. The words were simple, yet heavy with meaning, an acknowledgement that this was no ordinary enemy firepower. It was something more, something monstrous in its efficiency, its relentlessness, its capacity to destroy both stone and spirit alike. What Yamamoto did not yet know, what no Japanese soldier on Pelu could yet comprehend, was the nature of the weapon that had wrought this devastation. The M2 Browning .50 caliber heavy machine gun, a product of American industrial ingenuity, had made its debut against prepared Japanese positions, and it was unlike anything the Pacific theater had ever seen. With a rate of fire that could exceed 500 rounds per minute, ammunition capable of penetrating armor and fortified positions at ranges beyond any rifle, and a sound that seemed to promise death itself, it would redefine infantry combat. The M2 was more than metal and gunpowder. It was a psychological hammer, a demonstration of industrial warfare, and a symbol of what modern combat would demand. Its first appearance on Bloody Nose Ridge would foreshadow the collapse of entire defensive doctrines across the Pacific. Soldiers trained for months, placed in positions calculated to withstand artillery, found themselves powerless. Their courage remained, but their strategies had been rendered obsolete. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the scarred ridges and smoking bunkers below, Yamamoto understood that his men were facing something they could not fight through planning alone. The roar of the M2 was not just a warning, it was a statement. It was the arrival of a new era of warfare, one in which industrial firepower could unmake mountains, demolish fortresses, and break the human will to resist, all in the span of mere minutes. In that moment, Bloody Nose Ridge became a crucible. It tested courage, discipline, and the limits of preparation. And it would forever mark the day when Japanese infantry would meet the devil's weapon, and the world would witness how industrial ingenuity could turn the tide of battle before a single soldier could charge. The Japanese preparations, the illusion of safety. After the devastating losses at Tarawa in November 1943, where 4,690 Japanese defenders were killed in a mere 76 hours, the Imperial Army's leadership recognized that brute courage alone could no longer secure a Pacific island. The General Headquarters had meticulously revised defensive doctrine for every garrison scattered across the vast ocean, issuing updated tactical manuals that combined battlefield experience, engineering calculations, and lessons drawn from every failed and successful stand against American assaults. It was a doctrine that promised control, predictability, and, above all, survivability. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, appointed to command the defense of Pelu, received his copy of the revised manuals in May 1944. He pored over them with a fervor bordering on obsession, aware that the fate of his 10,500 men, and the strategic value of the island, rested squarely on his understanding of American tactics. The manuals were exhaustive. They contained detailed analyses of every amphibious landing in the Pacific, including Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam, specifying the effective ranges of enemy rifles, the cadence of automatic fire, and the destructive potential of mortars and artillery. Nakagawa memorized every figure, every schematic, and every recommended fortification pattern, translating doctrine into concrete reality across the 6 square miles of Pelu's rugged terrain. The work that followed was grueling and relentless. Over the next 3 months, Nakagawa's men carved 500 reinforced positions into the coral and limestone bedrock of the island. Bloody Nose Ridge, the narrow, jagged spine overlooking the invasion beaches, received particular attention. Here, positions were interwoven into a seemingly impenetrable network of defensive nodes, each designed to support its neighbors. Walls of coral limestone and poured concrete rose 2 to 5 feet thick, engineered to survive direct hits from 75mm artillery. Each bunker featured interlocking fields of fire, overlapping arcs designed to maximize suppression while minimizing friendly exposure. Type 92 heavy machine guns, firing 7.7mm rounds at 450 rounds per minute, were positioned to cover every likely approach, their calculated fire zones forming a lattice of lethal coverage across the ridge. Japanese doctrine was precise and mathematically rigorous. Rifle fire was expected to engage advancing enemy infantry at 600 yards, suppression fire would begin at 400 yards, and elimination was planned for 200 yards. Every angle had been measured, every approach accounted for. Nakagawa's engineers had even performed stress tests on coral walls, factoring in recoil, projectile velocity, and blast overpressure. Defensive calculations filled dozens of pages in staff manuals, the number of rounds needed to suppress a platoon, the optimal angles for crossfire, and the placement of machine guns to cover potential blind spots. In theory, the ridge was a fortress, invulnerable to the conventional threats they expected. Yet beneath the veneer of control, a fatal assumption had been made. The Japanese had no knowledge of the weapon that would confront them, the American M2 Browning .50 caliber heavy machine gun. They had never encountered a gun capable of firing half-inch rounds with such relentless speed, range, and destructive power. Their calculations accounted for the 7.7mm Type 92, which could penetrate light fortifications at 800 meters. but they had no data for a weapon capable of shredding coral and steel alike, destroying light vehicles at 1,500 yards, and inflicting lethal force against personnel at distances exceeding 2,000 yards. Colonel Nakagawa's meticulous planning had created an illusion of safety. Every wall, every firing slit, every overlapping field of fire had been designed to blunt the expected American assault. Yet these defenses were conceived with a critical blind spot. They assumed parity in weapons technology and ammunition effectiveness. They had assumed that American machine guns would behave like their own, firing controlled bursts, limited in range, and unable to breach their carefully reinforced positions. Every calculation, every test, and every assumption was predicated on the notion that a soldier could take cover behind 3 feet of concrete or a coral barricade and survive. In reality, this illusion would crumble within minutes. The defensive network Nakagawa had built was formidable on paper and in theory, but it had never been tested against the thunder of the M2. Coral walls, engineered to resist artillery, were about to be pierced by armor-piercing rounds. Machine gun nests, aligned to provide crossfire, would be neutralized by sustained fire from ranges the Japanese had deemed safe. And the soldiers themselves, trained to fight to the death behind these fortifications, would face an enemy whose industrial firepower turned every calculation into futility. Even as the men of Pelu polished their rifles, checked their ammunition, and whispered final prayers to their ancestors, they were unaware that the rules of warfare had changed. They were prepared for every imaginable contingency, artillery strikes, naval bombardments, and waves of infantry, but not for a weapon that could combine the range of artillery with the precision of small arms, the velocity of thought with the weight of steel. Their fortifications, which had taken months of labor, would soon become tombs or traps, not because of courage or lack thereof, but because modern industrial firepower operated on a scale their doctrine could not anticipate. As the sun rose higher on Bloody Nose Ridge, casting jagged shadows across the coral ramparts, Nakagawa and his officers conducted their final inspections. The illusion of safety was complete. Every bunker was manned, every machine gun prepared, every calculation double-checked. The ridge looked invincible, an unbreachable fortress overlooking the calm, pale blue waters of the invasion beaches below. But beneath the concrete and coral, and behind the disciplined faces of his soldiers, the seed of catastrophe had already been sown. They were about to meet a weapon that would make every assumption, every preparation, and every wall meaningless. And the battlefield of Pelu would never be the same. The birth of the devil weapon, M2 Browning. The M2 Browning was not born of mere necessity. It was the culmination of decades of engineering foresight and relentless innovation. Its story began in 1918, in the final year of the First World War, when John Moses Browning, a man whose genius would come to define modern firearms, sketched the first designs for an anti-aircraft weapon capable of halting enemy planes before they could unleash destruction on the battlefield below. Browning's vision was elegant in its simplicity, a weapon that combined extreme power with mechanical reliability, one that could deliver death at a distance beyond the reach of traditional rifles or machine guns. For years, the M2 existed quietly in the arsenals, a monster waiting for its moment. By the late 1930s, as the world once again braced for total war, American engineers began to adapt Browning's original design for ground combat. The transformation would give birth to a weapon whose specifications seemed almost mythic, a machine so powerful that its mere presence altered the psychology of warfare. The ammunition alone was terrifying. Each round, known as the .50 BMG, measured 5.45 inches in length and weighed a staggering 661 grains. It was a projectile designed not for subtlety, but for sheer destructive force. Fired from the M2, each round left the barrel at an incredible velocity of 2,910 feet per second, generating 13,350 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. To put this into perspective, a single .50 caliber round carried more destructive power than a light artillery shell of the early 20th century. Coral fortifications, concrete walls, and sandbag emplacements, all the painstaking labor that soldiers invested in creating their defensive positions, could not withstand the concentrated fury of its fire. Its rate of fire was equally formidable. The M2 could unleash 450 to 550 rounds per minute in sustained bursts, a continuous torrent that no human or light vehicle could endure for long. And yet, despite this mechanical onslaught, the gun was engineered to resist overheating, a testament to Browning's meticulous understanding of metallurgy, recoil management, and automatic feed mechanisms. The effective range of the M2 further elevated it from a simple machine gun to an instrument of industrial-scale terror. Against personnel, it could reach out to 2,000 yards, nearly 2 kilometers, flattening troops long before they reached the killing zone of conventional small arms. Against light vehicles, its armor-piercing rounds could strike with devastating precision up to 1,500 yards. The weapon's mobility, a seemingly minor feature, added another layer to its lethality. At 84 pounds on a tripod, it was heavy enough to stabilize those monstrous rounds but light enough to be mounted on jeeps, half-tracks, or even tanks, transforming it into a versatile platform capable of both static defense and rapid redeployment. By the time American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, the M2 had evolved into more than just a firearm. It was a psychological weapon. Marines and soldiers who had trained for months on coral ridges, fortified bunkers, and reinforced positions quickly realized that the M2 operated on a scale they had never imagined. It was not merely about killing the enemy. It was about breaking his confidence, his sense of invulnerability, his very expectation of safety. A machine gun with this power did not just pierce concrete, it shattered illusions. Accounts from the first engagements in the Pacific read like the chronicles of mythic terror. Defenders, trained to survive naval bombardment and heavy artillery, found their bunkers ripped open by rounds that seemed almost alive, tearing through coral and steel as though they were paper. Soldiers who had previously endured hours of fire from Type 92 machine guns were cut down in moments, often before they could raise their heads to understand the source of the onslaught. The sound itself was a psychological assault, a continuous thunderous roar that rattled bones, shattered nerves, and filled hearts with a primal fear. Marine reports described the weapon with a mixture of awe and dread. It was called the Devil's Gun, not because it was inscrutable or magical, but because it embodied a level of mechanical and destructive perfection that felt almost supernatural to those on the receiving end. Its rounds flattened bunkers, pierced light armor, and killed with an efficiency that defied human comprehension. But beyond physical destruction, the M2 Browning dominated the battlefield psychologically, instilling a sense of helplessness in defenders who had once believed their fortifications were impenetrable. By the time the weapon made its Pacific debut in battles like Peleliu, the defenders' meticulous calculations, the ranges of engagement, the protective strength of walls, the overlapping fields of fire, proved almost irrelevant. The M2 Browning did not merely overcome defensive preparations, it rendered them meaningless. For every meter of coral ridge carefully fortified, every sandbag slit for a Type 92, there was now a projectile capable of annihilating it with terrifying ease. In essence, the M2 Browning was more than a machine gun. It was the embodiment of industrial firepower distilled into a portable, relentless, and utterly devastating package. It redefined the battlefield, reshaped defensive doctrine, and left an indelible mark on the psychology of soldiers on both sides. For those who faced it in the Pacific, there could be no doubt, this was the Akuma no Buki, the devil's weapon. First contact, White Beach 1, Peleliu, 6:12 hours. The dawn mist clung to the jagged coastline of Peleliu, masking the chaos that would soon erupt across White Beach 1. At precisely 0612 hours, the calm that had hung over the fortified ridge for months was about to be shattered by a sound no one on the island had ever heard. Sergeant Raymond Fitzgerald, a battle-hardened Marine from the 1st Marine Division, lay chest-deep in the cold, salty Pacific waters with his crew, their hands gripping the 128-pound M2 Browning heavy machine gun as if it were an extension of their own bodies. Mortar shells rained down from Japanese positions atop Bloody Nose Ridge, hissing through the morning air, splashing into the surf and carving out temporary craters in the sand. Each explosion was a reminder that death was everywhere, and that only precision, coordination, and brute force could carry them forward. Hauling the massive weapon forward through chest-deep water was a feat in itself. The M2 was designed to dominate the battlefield, but it was not designed to be carried across beaches under fire, where every step threatened to sink into mud or coral rubble. Fitzgerald's crew moved with mechanical efficiency, muscles straining under the weight, faces set with grim determination. Behind them, the roar of approaching landing craft signaled the rest of the battalion pushing forward. But for the men at the tip of the spear, the moment of truth was singular, immediate, and terrifying. By 06:14, the M2 was in position. Fitzgerald laid the tripod down, locked it into place, and scanned the ridge ahead. His target was a reinforced Japanese bunker, perched 650 yards up the slope, a fortress that had been meticulously engineered to withstand every type of assault known to the Imperial Army. The concrete walls, 2 to 5 feet thick, had been poured over coral limestone, reinforced with steel beams, and designed to survive not only infantry assault but sustained artillery bombardment. Inside, the defenders manned their Type 92 heavy machine guns, rifles, and mortars, confident in the doctrine that had kept Pellu's Bloody Nose Ridge safe from every previous attack. But what they had not anticipated, what no tactical manual could have predicted, was the M2 Browning, firing .50 caliber rounds that carried the destructive power of light artillery, yet could be deployed by a single well-trained crew. Fitzgerald squeezed the trigger, and the first round ripped through the morning air with a metallic scream. The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. Coral shattered as if brittle glass, concrete cracked under the concentrated force, and fragments of both flew in every direction. Inside the bunker, Japanese defenders scrambled in panic, some thrown to the floor by the concussion, others ducking helplessly as the walls themselves betrayed them. The thunderous, continuous roar of the M2 dominated the soundscape, drowning out the whine of mortars and the distant pounding of naval artillery. In 15 seconds, the fortress that had seemed unassailable was compromised, its walls riddled with gaping holes, the defenders' morale shattered almost as thoroughly as their physical defenses. When the Japanese attempted to return fire, the M2's dominance became even more apparent. Fitzgerald's crew adjusted the tripod, aimed at the next firing slit, and unleashed another burst. Each round cut through wood, steel, and coral with surgical precision, leaving no safe haven, no place to regroup. The defenders' carefully calculated fields of fire, which should have overlapped and covered every approach, were now deadly traps for themselves. The weapon they had never encountered turned their planning against them. Across White Beach 1, the rhythm of destruction became almost musical in its relentlessness. Fitzgerald shifted targets with mechanical efficiency, sweeping the M2 from bunker to bunker, each volley punctuated by the echoing thunder that seemed to shake the ridge itself. In the water and on the sand, Marines witnessed the power of the Browning firsthand. A single crew of 3 men could render a fortified ridge, years in preparation, effectively neutralized within minutes. Men who had trained their entire lives to repel invaders were forced to abandon positions, their precision fire doctrine rendered obsolete by the sheer kinetic power of the .50 caliber rounds. Observers later described the scene as surreal. Smoke and dust rose in plumes, mingling with the early morning haze, and fragments of coral and concrete littered the ground like shattered sculpture. The defenders were visible through the gaps in the wreckage, scrambling for cover, sometimes trying to fire back with rifles that now seemed absurdly inadequate against the onslaught. And yet, amidst the chaos, Fitzgerald and his crew operated with a calm focus, their every action honed by months of training, their synergy with the M2 transforming them into a singular force of devastation. Within moments, the psychological impact of the weapon became as evident as the physical destruction. Japanese soldiers began retreating into tunnels, attempting to regroup in positions they believed safe, only to find that no part of the ridge offered sanctuary from the continuous barrage. The M2 Browning had introduced a new calculus to combat in the Pacific. Firepower could now dominate not just space but time, allowing a single mobile team to rewrite the battlefield before the enemy had a chance to respond. By the end of that first engagement, the M2 had done more than destroy bunkers. It had rewritten the rules of defensive warfare in the Pacific. Fitzgerald's initial salvo at 0614 was just the beginning of a symphony of destruction, a prelude to what would become known among Japanese troops as Akuma no Buki, the Devil's Weapon. On Pellu, The ridge that had seemed impregnable now trembled under the sound of thunderous, unstoppable fire, and the Marines understood, in visceral terms, the power they wielded. Psychological devastation, the Devil's Roar. On Pellu's Bloody Nose Ridge, the dawn of September 15, 1944, had already rewritten the rules of combat, but the true weapon of the M2 Browning was not measured in feet of coral shattered or concrete walls breached. Its deadliest power was psychological, the invisible, creeping terror that spread faster than the rounds themselves. By the time Sergeant Raymond Fitzgerald and his crew had begun their relentless advance across White Beach 1, Japanese soldiers were not only facing destruction, they were confronting an entirely new dimension of fear. For months, the defenders had drilled endlessly. They had memorized terrain, rehearsed fields of fire, and refined interlocking positions to a near-perfect symphony of defensive calculation. Every bunker, every slit, every firing position had been built to withstand bombardments, suppress assaulting infantry, and grind an enemy into dust. Yet when the M2 Browning unleashed its first salvo, all calculations, all doctrine, all confidence evaporated like mist in the rising sun. The weapon's thunderous roar was constant, unstoppable, and devastatingly precise. It shattered the perception of invulnerability that had been cultivated by years of discipline. Reports from Japanese communications reveal the terror in their own words. Intercepted messages contained terms that would later become legendary. Jiga Kunoi Hell's Machine appeared repeatedly in field logs. Officers, normally composed and stoic, scribbled frantic notes, attempting to convey the scale of the threat. The ridge collapses without breach, one message read. Morale is annihilated. Men are paralyzed before engagement. These were not exaggerations. They were real-time reflections of a phenomenon no textbook had prepared them for. The defenders were experiencing a fear that was both tangible and metaphysical, a recognition that their carefully prepared fortifications could no longer guarantee survival. This psychological devastation unfolded methodically. The first M2 salvo might have destroyed a bunker physically, but even untouched positions were rendered ineffective. Soldiers inside would hear the shriek of the .50 caliber rounds tearing through coral, concrete, and steel nearby, each impact a thunderclap signaling imminent annihilation. The mathematical precision of Japanese defensive doctrine, 600 yards for rifle fire, 400 yards for suppression, 200 yards for elimination, was meaningless in the face of a weapon capable of reaching out 1,500 yards, obliterating the familiar safety thresholds. Men abandoned positions that were structurally intact, fleeing into tunnels or open ground in a desperate bid to survive. In many cases, retreat was not an act of strategy but of pure instinctive terror. Field reports from Pellu confirmed that the M2's psychological effect was as lethal as its physical impact. Communications intercepted by American forces reveal accounts of entire platoons abandoning fortifications before Marines even reached the waterline. Commanders noted positions neutralized without assault, a phrase that seemed contradictory in its understatement. Yet it was literal truth. The sound, the force, the sheer presence of the M2, what Marines would soon nickname the Devil's Weapon, was sufficient to compel surrender or flight. What emerged on Pellu was a new calculus of warfare, one in which fear could be quantified almost like artillery. The Marines observed that soldiers exposed to sustained M2 fire exhibited predictable psychological patterns: hesitation, confusion, miscommunication, and eventual retreat. The mathematics of fear, distance, volume, trajectory, and repetition of destructive fire, had become as operationally significant as bullets or shells. Every burst from Fitzgerald's crew was a statement. No wall was safe, no tactic sufficient, no preparation enough. Soldiers learned, almost before their minds could fully process the threat, that resistance was increasingly futile. Inside the bunkers, the effect was compounded by confusion and disbelief. Officers barked orders, demanding that men hold positions, man firing slits, and return fire. But the soundscape was alien. The M2's high-caliber rounds tore through familiar terrain with a velocity and kinetic energy previously only seen in artillery bombardment. Men saw comrades thrown from positions by sheer concussive force, Walls fractured before their eyes, and yet the rounds kept coming, as if the machine itself were alive. In some cases, defenders reportedly froze, unable to fire, paralyzed by the relentless roar and the knowledge that survival was uncertain. By mid-morning, the Devil's Roar had fundamentally altered the battlefield dynamics. Bunkers that had taken months to fortify were abandoned in minutes. Japanese commanders found themselves attempting to coordinate defenses across a ridge where fear had replaced order, where retreat often preceded any physical breach, and where the M2 had become the ultimate arbiter of combat effectiveness. The weapon did more than destroy fortifications. It destroyed certainty, planning, and confidence, leaving chaos in its wake. The M2 Browning's psychological dominance on Peleliu would later influence military doctrine across the Pacific. Commanders recognized that a weapon's impact could not be measured solely by its physical destruction, but also by its ability to instill fear, disrupt coordination, and break morale. The mathematics of bullets had always been central to strategy. Now the mathematics of fear, distance, velocity, volume, and psychological effect had joined the arsenal. By nightfall on September 15th, reports filtered back through Japanese command that entire sections of Bloody Nose Ridge were effectively neutralized without traditional assault. Survivors described the weapon as a force beyond comprehension, a hell's machine that struck before men could respond, a tangible embodiment of dread. In the Pacific theater, the M2 Browning had not only redefined firepower, it had redefined fear itself. The Devil's Roar had arrived, and the battlefield would never be the same. Industrial war, unlimited ammunition and firepower. As the sun climbed over Peleliu on September 15, 1944, the roar of the M2 Browning heavy machine guns became the heartbeat of the American assault. But the effectiveness of these weapons went far beyond their mechanical specifications, their devastating kinetic energy, or the terror they inspired in the Japanese defenders. The true force behind each round of .50 caliber fire was America's industrial might, the vast, almost limitless machinery of war that made sustained, relentless bombardment possible. On the beaches, Sergeant Raymond Fitzgerald and his crew worked tirelessly, reloading the M2 Browning as quickly as their strength allowed. Each weapon weighed 84 pounds, plus the tripod, and each round was 661 grains of pure destruction traveling at 2,910 feet per second. The effort was immense, yet it was only a fraction of the larger logistical orchestration that made such continuous fire possible. Behind every squad of Marines lay an intricate chain of production, transportation, and supply, a network of factories, ships, and depots that stretched thousands of miles from American factories to the front lines of the Pacific. Liberty ships arrived at dawn and dusk, unloading pallets of .50 caliber ammunition onto makeshift docks. Each round represented more than a bullet. It represented the combined power of American steel mills, gunpowder factories, and transportation networks operating at wartime tempo. Whereas Japanese garrisons, including Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's 10,500 men on Peleliu, had to calculate every round with painstaking precision, rationing Type 92 ammunition, ensuring reserves for counterattacks. The Americans had the freedom to fire thousands of rounds without hesitation. Ammunition became a weapon as inexhaustible as the M2 itself. This disparity in supply fundamentally altered the battlefield. Where Japanese defensive doctrine had focused on maximizing efficiency, careful positioning, interlocking fields of fire, conserving every bullet, the Americans operated under the logic of industrial war. Firepower could be sustained without end, and the attrition of enemy positions could be absolute. Each bunker hit by an M2 salvo was not merely a tactical engagement, it was a demonstration of strategic depth. The defenders faced destruction not just in isolation, but as part of a larger, unstoppable tidal wave of American industry. Reports from Peleliu's Bloody Nose Ridge highlight the psychological impact of this industrial scale. Japanese soldiers, already unnerved by the sheer power of the M2, quickly realized that their limited supplies could not match the Americans' endless reserves. Even the most disciplined units could not withstand the knowledge that for every Type 92 round expended, the enemy could respond with hundreds more. What might have been a measured, calculated engagement became a race against an opponent whose capacity for destruction seemed infinite. Every salvo, every shattered bunker, reinforced the perception that the Americans had an inexhaustible arsenal. The Marines themselves were aware of this advantage. While they respected the skill and courage of their Japanese adversaries, they knew that the effectiveness of their M2S was amplified not just by technology but by supply. Each magazine emptied, each belt fed into the gun, was quickly replaced. No pause in fire was required, no rationing of lethal force constrained their tactics. The M2 had been terrifying in isolation, but in the hands of a well-supplied infantry, it became a weapon of industrial terror, an unstoppable hammer striking relentlessly against fortifications, bunkers, and the morale of the enemy. Across the ridge, Japanese officers tried to adapt. Nakagawa ordered rationing of ammunition, moved squads to conserve strength, and attempted counterattacks wherever possible. Yet these measures were only temporary reprieves. Every time a position was bombarded by the continuous thunder of M2 fire, the futility of their defensive planning became evident. Their world of carefully calculated fields of fire, interlocking machine guns, and reinforced bunkers was collapsing under a new paradigm, a world where the enemy could maintain a sustained barrage indefinitely. Industrial capacity had become as lethal as battlefield tactics. The consequences were tangible. Bunkers that had survived artillery were shredded by sustained M2 fire. Machine gun crews were suppressed or forced to retreat simply due to the volume of fire. Entire sectors of Bloody Nose Ridge were neutralized not by clever maneuver or infiltration, but by the relentless application of industrial power. Every round fired was proof that American strength was not ephemeral. It was built on a foundation of factories, shipping lanes, and an economy mobilized for total war. The Japanese could fight with courage, skill, and ingenuity, but these human qualities could not substitute for millions of rounds delivered with precision and consistency. By the end of the first day, the reality was clear. The combination of technological innovation, the M2 Browning, and industrial supremacy had created a new form of warfare. Success was no longer measured merely by troop movements or fortifications. It was measured by sustained application of destructive power, the ability to overwhelm any defensive system simply through relentless force. The M2 was no longer a weapon in isolation. It was the embodiment of industrial war, a physical manifestation of American production and strategic depth on the battlefield. As night fell on Peleliu, the echoes of the Devil's Roar had faded, but the consequences of industrial supremacy were unmistakable. The Japanese defenders, low on ammunition, low on morale, and facing an enemy whose firepower was inexhaustible, were trapped in a new reality. On this battlefield, victory belonged not only to the brave or the disciplined, but to the side with the capacity to produce, supply, and sustain war on an unprecedented scale. The M2 Browning had become more than a gun. It had become a symbol of industrial dominance, a weapon whose power derived not just from its design but from the vast machinery of the nation behind it. Legacy of Peleliu. The transformation of combat. By late November 1944, the island of Peleliu had been transformed from a seemingly impregnable fortress into a stark monument to the evolution of modern warfare. After 73 grueling days of combat, the battle concluded, leaving behind an extraordinary testament to the lethal combination of technology, industrial power, and battlefield innovation. The Imperial Japanese Army had suffered devastating losses. Out of 10,500 men assigned to defend the island, nearly 10,000 lay dead, their carefully constructed bunkers reduced to rubble. In contrast, the United States Marines endured 1,794 killed and 8,010 wounded, a grim toll, yet markedly lower than pre-invasion projections had estimated, largely because of the decisive power of the M2 Browning heavy machine gun. The Battle of Peleliu was more than a clash of manpower, it was a clash of eras. The Japanese defenders had come equipped with courage, training, and meticulous preparation, operating within doctrines honed from previous Pacific engagements. Each bunker, each interlocking field of fire, and every rationed round of ammunition had been calculated to maximize defensive efficiency. Yet the reality of combat on Peleliu revealed a harsh truth. No human calculation could fully account for the combined effects of a weapon capable of projecting sustained industrial-level firepower with psychological dominance. The M2 Browning, previously developed as an anti-aircraft weapon and adapted for ground use, had demonstrated capabilities far beyond what the Japanese could imagine. It was not merely a tool of destruction. It became a force multiplier that transformed small units into instruments of overwhelming fire. With a sustained rate of fire, tremendous range, and the ability to shred fortifications previously thought invulnerable, the M2's impact was both immediate and enduring. Bunkers that had been engineered to survive artillery were obliterated in moments, and the morale of defenders crumbled even faster than their positions. In essence, Pellu had become a proving ground for the future of infantry combat, where psychological and physical destruction intertwined. The legacy of the M2's role at Pellu extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Tactical manuals across the Pacific were revised to integrate lessons learned from the battle. Gunnery schools updated training regimens to emphasize the use of the .50 caliber heavy machine gun not just as a weapon of suppressive fire, but as a psychological instrument capable of shaping the battlefield without direct engagement. Field reports from Pellu were circulated widely among both frontline commanders and strategists in Washington, highlighting the unprecedented effectiveness of combining technological innovation with logistical superiority. The war had revealed a fundamental principle. In modern combat, the side capable of sustained, precise, and psychologically impactful firepower could redefine the rules of engagement. Veterans from both sides would later recall the battle in vivid, haunting terms. Japanese soldiers spoke of Akuma no Buki, or the devil's weapon, a name born from the incomprehensible destruction wrought by continuous .50 caliber fire. Survivors described the sound as a rolling thunder that seemed to arrive before death itself, shattering courage and sowing chaos even where physical damage was limited. American Marines remembered the relentless rhythm of the Browning, the way squads could advance with confidence, supported by the unceasing hail of rounds that reduced fear in the attackers while multiplying it in the defenders. The psychological dimension of the M2 had become as decisive as its physical impact, a lesson that would resonate in every subsequent Pacific operation. The technological and industrial aspects of the M2's success were inseparable. Without the capacity to produce millions of rounds annually, without the logistical networks to transport them to remote islands, the weapon would have remained formidable but not transformative. Pellu demonstrated how industrial supremacy could act as a force multiplier on the battlefield. Each round fired was not just a projectile but a tangible expression of the nation's manufacturing power. In doing so, it established a model for future conflicts, where the synergy of production, supply, and tactical application could overcome even the most disciplined and determined adversary. Post-war evaluations cemented the M2 Browning's place in military history. It became clear that the weapon was not a fleeting innovation of the Pacific Campaign, but a long-lasting component of infantry doctrine. Even 8 decades later, the .50 caliber heavy machine gun remained in service, a living legacy of Pellu and its lessons. Its reputation as a devil weapon endured, informing training programs, tactical manuals, and strategic planning in conflicts worldwide. The island of Pellu itself, scarred by craters, shattered bunkers, and the echoes of sustained bombardment, became a case study in how a single well-supported weapon could transform the battlefield. The ultimate lesson of Pellu transcended technical specifications. It revealed a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Preparation, fortification, and valor are indispensable, yet they can be overcome by superior firepower applied relentlessly and intelligently. The thunder of .50 caliber fire had demonstrated that courage alone could not withstand industrial-scale destruction. The battle underscored the reality that modern combat was as much about sustaining firepower and maintaining supply lines as it was about individual heroism or defensive ingenuity. In this sense, Pellu did not merely witness a battle, it witnessed the transformation of warfare itself. By the time the island fell into American hands, the rules of infantry combat had been rewritten. The M2 Browning was no longer just a gun. It had become a paradigm, a tool that defined the intersection of technology, psychology, and logistics. Pellu was proof that in modern war, industrial capability could amplify tactical skill to achieve decisive results. The devil's weapon had earned its name, and its legacy would shape military thinking for generations to come, reminding the world that in the crucible of battle, Power was measured not only in men and fortifications, but in the capacity to deliver destruction relentlessly, effectively, and without end.